It's getting to the point now where something is going very, very wrong in China. And so much is happening beneath the surface that it is hard to know where to start. But this is one of those cases where everything kind of all ties together. On the surface, we are seeing signs from all around the country that people are just completely fed up with how things are going. We've got protests against lockdowns and COVID policies, major real estate companies like Evergrande and Kaisa unable to pay their debt. Major Chinese banks are refusing to lend money to property developers, so there's no more credit available for the property market. The stock market is down 16% year to date. Almost all stocks are down. There's even talk of a shadow bank run on the biggest bank in the world, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. All of this comes after we saw a shocking collapse in exports from China as well, with the value of exports collapsing by almost 10%. And this is actually not including the most recent October figures, which are likely to be even worse. Now, on the surface, it may look like China's economy has ground to a complete halt. But we have to look deeper than that, because what we find is truly terrifying. Even if China manages to ride out these storms that it's facing right now, I genuinely do not see how they can come out of this without a decade or more of lost growth. China's economy looks set to shrink in size in 2023, and that's not just my opinion. It's also the opinion of the government themselves. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. The latest GDP figures for China came out at the end of last year. It's Q3 of 2022. And China reported growth of just 3% year on year. Now, it's important to remember that China likes to play games with the way they report their data. A few years ago, they changed the way they calculate GDP and basically made it so that year-on-year comparisons are pretty much meaningless. If you compare Q3 of 2022 to Q3 of 2021, then yes, China grew by 3%. But if you compare Q2 of 2022 to Q2 of 2021, then China grew by 8%. And if you compare Q1 of 2022 to Q1 of 2021, then China grew by an incredible 15%. The best way to analyze China's GDP figures is to take a rolling total over 4 quarters. When we do that, we can see that, compared to the 4 quarters prior, China's economy was only 2% larger. Compared to the rolling total from 2 years ago, China's economy is now 4% smaller. This is very important because the Chinese economy is already the second largest in the world. A 4% drop is absolutely gigantic. And it gets worse when we compare this with the population growth figures from China. Their population grew by 5.3% last year. And when we combine both of these figures together, we can see that on a per capita basis, the Chinese economy shrank by 9% last year. And this is why it is so hard to talk about China's economic growth without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. When you compare year-on-year figures, China looks like they've been growing like crazy. But if you look at any other way, whether that be quarter-on-quarter or better yet rolling totals, then we can see that China's economy is actually shrinking. And this is before we even talk about inflation. China's reported inflation is currently at 2%, but reality is probably closer to 10%. So in real terms, their economy probably shrank by about 12% last year. That is an absolutely astronomical figure. And it means that the average Chinese person is now worse off than they were 2 years ago. I think that it's really important that we try and understand why this is happening, because I don't think it's being talked about enough. And there's essentially 3 reasons why China's economy is doing so badly. The first is the zero COVID policy. In some ways, it's hard to believe that this is still going on in 2023, because the rest of the world has moved on from the pandemic. But for whatever reason, China is sticking to their zero COVID policies, and they're not even trying to hide it anymore. They've essentially given up on trying to convince people that there is a massive problem in the country. And instead, they're doubling down and telling everyone that this is normal. Just look at this article from the Global Times. It's titled, "Experts Say China's COVID Policy is Scientific and Effective as Cases Rise." And it says that China should stick with its zero COVID strategy, because COVID is still relatively deadly, and the immunity of the Chinese population is still relatively weak. Basically, the Chinese government doesn't want to open up because they fear a massive wave of infections. And while that might be true, it's kind of missing the bigger picture here, because the country's economy is collapsing as a direct result of the lockdowns. The country is facing a wave of infections, whether they like it or not, just probably not the type of wave that they were expecting. The second reason why China's economy is struggling is the property crash. Now, I've made several videos on the Chinese property market already. The situation is simply this. For many years, China's property market was the engine of the entire economy. Whenever China's economy started to slow down, they would just build more houses and employ more people to work in construction, and pretty much everything would go back to normal. But the Chinese property market has finally collapsed after years of speculation and overbuilding. Companies like Evergrande, Casa, and Sunac China holdings are collapsing, and hundreds of smaller developers have already defaulted. And this is going to have a knock-on effect throughout the entire economy. Thousands of Chinese citizens have protested against this recently, calling for home buyers to boycott mortgages altogether. Now, this is unlikely to happen because I doubt Chinese citizens have fully realized how serious the situation is. But if the lockdowns continue and people realize that they might never get their money back, then we could see more widespread mortgage boycotts, which will make the situation even worse. The third reason why China's economy is doing so badly is because they've effectively cut themselves off from the rest of the world. Just a few years ago, China became the world's largest exporter, and since then, they've grown that lead massively. They exported goods worth nearly $3 trillion in 2022 alone. And on the surface, that looks like a good thing. After all, exporting more goods means that your currency should appreciate and your country is making more money. But China is the only major country in the world whose currency is actually getting weaker, not stronger. And that's because China's trade isn't actually growing. It's collapsing. The value of China's exports fell by almost 10% last year, and it looks like the trend is continuing into 2023. In October alone, the value of China's exports fell by another 15%. Now, this is not being caused by a lack of demand either. Many countries around the world are still ordering as much from China as they ever did. It's just that they're not paying as much for it. For example, in the US, the cost of imports from China fell by almost 13% in October alone. This is a perfect example of how China is the only country in the world where you can actually save money by importing more stuff. China's currency is getting weaker and weaker. And unless they fix their problems, that's unlikely to change. But I think it's safe to say that China won't be fixing any of these problems anytime soon. And while they may be able to recover from this, I just don't see how they can avoid a decade or more of lost growth. The average Chinese citizen is now worse off than they were 2 years ago. Their economy is on track to shrink in 2023, and their currency is getting weaker and weaker every day. Now, this is not the first time that China has faced economic turmoil, but the longer that Xi Jinping stays in power, the harder it's going to be for them to bounce back. This is not financial advice.